For nearly 2 centuries, one iconic company sat at the very center of American agriculture, forging a bond of loyalty and tradition so strong that farmers across the country swore by its green and yellow machines. That company was John Deere, a name once synonymous with rugged reliability and the unbreakable backbone of the American heartland. Generations of rural communities thrived under its banner, relying on the brand's tractors, harvesters, and combines to feed millions of people around the world. Grandparents passed down their John Deere equipment and their admiration for it to their children and grandchildren, treating it like an inheritance that represented not just practical farming, but a cultural way of life. But why exactly did such a venerable institution decide to uproot its American manufacturing base and shift operations to Mexico, of all places? How did that single act shake the foundation of an entire $34.5 billion industry so dramatically that farmers revolted and family farms fell like dominoes into bankruptcy? And more ominously, what role did climate change, labor shortages, and a renewed sense of political chaos all play in compounding that crisis until it spiraled completely out of control? In today's deep dive, we're peeling back the layers of a story that's part economic betrayal, part political showdown, and entirely devastating to the ordinary men and women who feed us every single day. You'll witness how outraged farmers turned their backs on a company they once considered family. You'll see how a titanic battle with the White House unexpectedly destroyed rural communities, left entire harvests rotting in the fields, and wiped out America's long-standing dominance in world agriculture. And you'll understand how, amid the collapsing remains of what used to be the beating heart of U.S. farming, other nations, the European Union, Brazil, Argentina, India, stood ready to fill that void, forever shifting the balance of power in global food production. John Deere, once revered for building its success on the sweat and devotion of American workers, made a decision that seemed to shatter its bedrock values. Seeking to reduce labor costs and boost short-term profits, the company quietly unveiled plans to shift manufacturing from several plants in the Midwest to brand new facilities in Mexico. At first, many people assumed this was some corporate rumor, the sort of talk that surfaces during uncertain economic times but never sees the light of day. That assumption proved wrong. Executives not only confirmed the rumor, but stood by it, explaining that in a modern, globally competitive world, their hands were tied. Their justification was simple. To remain competitive with foreign machinery manufacturers, they needed to cut costs dramatically, and that meant outsourcing production outside of the United States. For the average American farmer, the news struck like a bolt of lightning. Men and women who had spent generations trusting Deere Green to get them through planting and harvest felt personally wounded. The brand had not just been any supplier of farming equipment, it was part of rural culture. People had pictures of their grandparents on the original steel plows or old, bright green tractors that carried them through harsh winters and bumper crop summers. Now, the same company that had grown rich off farmers' loyalty was pulling the rug out from under their feet. It wasn't long before the White House responded, but no one quite expected the tone. Donald Trump thundered across social media and podiums alike, accusing John Deere of betraying the American working class. In a fiery speech, he labeled the outsourcing plan treason against the American workforce and vowed to strike back with a bold solution: a punishing 200% tariff on any John Deere equipment manufactured outside U.S. borders. Overnight, the company found itself caught in a political crossfire, scorned by the president, and quickly losing the trust of the people whose livelihoods it had underpinned. One might have thought John Deere's leadership would reassess the outsourcing move in light of the extraordinary backlash. Instead, they doubled down. Their stance was firm. The labor was cheaper and the profits were higher overseas. The consequences of that unyielding approach set the stage for a widespread revolt, one that would unite farmers, factory workers, and entire small-town communities against a corporate giant they believed had sold them out. Although John Deere had made a fortune by selling itself as the farmer's best friend, that image collapsed overnight. In rural coffee shops and on farming forums across the Midwest, people seethed at the company's perceived betrayal. Many farmers already felt cornered by John Deere's restrictive repair policies, policies that effectively forced them to buy expensive software licenses just to fix a broken tractor. The right to repair battles had been simmering in the background for years as the company's proprietary systems forbade farmers from performing many simple maintenance tasks on their own. The shift to Mexico became the spark that ignited a full-blown rebellion. Within days of the announcement, outraged farmers formed online groups calling for a boycott. They insisted that no matter how reliable John Deere's tractors had once been, the brand had lost its soul. Independent dealers who carried Deere equipment felt the shock first. Their longtime customers suddenly refused even to step inside showrooms showcasing the bright green machines. At county fairs, where John Deere's presence had been as predictable as funnel cakes, farmers staged protests in front of exhibits telling passers-by to consider alternative brands like Kubota, AGCO, or Case IH, companies that maintained a friendlier approach to repairs and labor. This grassroots movement quickly spread to social media, where hashtags condemning the company flooded rural Twitter. Pictures of farmers painting over the John Deere logo on their barns became the new symbol of rural defiance, something unthinkable just a few years prior. The demonstrations were about more than just equipment. Each tractor or combine was bound up with a sense of identity, heritage, and local pride. Now that John Deere had so casually transferred jobs to another country, farmers believed the brand had assaulted the very notion of a community-based agricultural lifestyle. What truly shook the executives, though, was the rapid shift in purchasing behavior. Most of these communities had for decades paid top dollar for John Deere products simply out of loyalty. Suddenly, that loyalty was shattered. Tractor dealerships saw a dramatic drop in orders as buyers turned to any brand that wasn't aligned with John Deere. The corporate machine realized it could lose not just a few disgruntled customers, but entire regions that had once been guaranteed markets. In the boardrooms, they might have once asked, how bad could it get? The answer? Far worse than anyone at headquarters had anticipated. The story of John Deere's betrayal was not just about the farmers who felt blindsided. It was also about the factory workers who had built their lives around assembling the machinery that powered America's farms. In Midwestern towns scattered across Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, entire generations had taken pride in making the iconic green equipment. To them, the brand was a source of economic stability that provided a decent wage, health care benefits, and a sense of shared community. Many workers took their first job at a John Deere plant straight out of high school and stayed until retirement. When these men and women discovered their jobs were being shipped to Mexico, the heartbreak was immediate. The news arrived through hushed rumors and internal memos, eventually confirmed by official announcements. Some families had multiple generations working in the same factory: parents, children, cousins, uncles. Now, they faced a terrifying truth. The source of their livelihood was gone. Their roots pulled up with no warning. Outsourcing meant entire shifts would be eliminated, entire wings of plants would be closed, and local economies would lose the payroll taxes and consumer spending that had kept them humming for decades. Union leaders and labor activists mobilized at once. The United Auto Workers, UAW, which represented many of John Deere's employees, organized strikes, boycotts, and marches to galvanize both workers and the surrounding community. Banners reading, "Deere sold us out," and "Stop corporate greed" appeared overnight outside factory gates as hundreds of men and women marched in protest. News channels captured images of tearful employees holding signs and chanting slogans. Town hall meetings escalated into furious debates about corporate accountability, capitalist greed, and the role of government in protecting American labor. But if workers hoped that John Deere's executives would backtrack on the outsourcing plan, they were sorely disappointed. The company repeated its line about global competitiveness, even in the face of hundreds, then thousands of outraged employees. Each job lost felt not just like a personal tragedy, but a betrayal of the community's future. Nearby diners, grocery stores, and hardware shops stood empty, anticipating the worst. Without those worker paychecks, entire local economies faced decline. Children wondered if mom or dad would be able to pay for new school supplies in the fall, or if they'd have to relocate entirely. The fury and heartbreak that gripped these factory communities poured fresh gasoline on the fire that had already erupted among farmers. Now, both the producers and the makers of the agricultural machinery had found a common enemy, and they soon discovered that the government's swift reaction would bring unexpected collateral damage to their already tense situation. Donald Trump's response to John Deere's move was as brazen as one might expect: a colossal 200% tariff on any Deere equipment manufactured outside of the United States. In theory, this penalty was meant to punish the company for what Trump termed a treasonous decision against American workers. In practice, however, these tariffs triggered a devastating cascade of unintended consequences. Farmers, who had already felt betrayed by the outsourcing, found themselves hit hardest by the very tariffs intended to protect them. Equipment they needed for planting and harvesting suddenly cost double. Some units even tripled in price because companies typically pass tariff costs directly on to consumers. The chaos rippled across the entire farming cycle. Tractors that once sold for $60,000 now soared beyond $100,000. Repair costs ballooned as well, since replacement parts and specialized software updates had to cross the U.S. border under stiff tariffs. Supply chains that had functioned smoothly for decades became snarled in border inspections, shipping delays, and bureaucratic slowdowns. Countless farmers who had budgeted for a new harvester or combine to keep their operation afloat found themselves in a financial tight spot, forced to either buy used equipment at inflated prices or do without. Those who turned to older machinery quickly discovered that the used market was just as insane. With new tractor prices skyrocketing, demand for secondhand equipment soared. Auction yards saw bidding wars break out for battered machines built decades ago. The entire cost structure of farm operations fell out of sync. The extra expense landed on top of existing struggles, such as rising fuel prices, equipment upkeep, and tight margins in crop pricing, pushing many farmers to the brink of bankruptcy. Banks were uneasy about extending credit to farmers caught in a swirling storm of higher equipment costs and uncertain policy. Many small farmers, especially those who barely scraped by each season, found lenders unwilling to take a chance on them. For these local producers, the dream of passing the family farm down to their children began to evaporate, replaced by the desperate question, how do we survive this year? The frustration that had already turned into a boycott now escalated, leading to more vocal confrontations, activist rallies, and pleas for immediate government intervention. Yet, unbeknownst to many Americans fixated on the rising price of tractors, a parallel crisis was unfolding in the fields themselves. Without the labor force that typically handled everything from planting to harvesting, the situation in the heartland was about to get far more desperate. While headlines spotlighted John Deere's outsourcing and the tariff war, a quieter but equally devastating crisis was developing: the labor shortage caused by stricter immigration crackdowns. For decades, American agriculture had relied heavily on undocumented workers, many from Latin America, to fill demanding, low-paying roles that citizens often avoided. These laborers did the back-breaking work of picking strawberries, harvesting lettuce, or corralling livestock under the hot sun. Their labor had always been the invisible backbone of the food supply chain, and without them, crops simply couldn't get to market. As Trump's administration intensified raids and stepped up deportations, farm owners in California, Arizona, Florida, and beyond saw their workforce vanish almost overnight. Fields of fresh produce were left rotting because there simply weren't enough hands to pick them. The shortage was especially acute for perishable fruits and vegetables. One or two missed days of harvesting could cost thousands of dollars, and entire lost weeks could obliterate a season's worth of income. Even on farms that managed to retain some workers, morale plummeted and costs soared. In desperation, some farmers raised wages to attract domestic labor, but it made little difference. Many U.S. citizens were unwilling to endure the intense manual labor required in farm fields, and those who were willing to try usually demanded significantly higher pay, pushing farmers' margins to the breaking point. Meanwhile, agricultural advocacy groups pleaded for a more sensible, humane immigration policy, one that acknowledged the essential role these workers played in America's food system. They cautioned that removing the agricultural workforce would lead to widespread disruptions, forcing farms to downsize or close altogether. Despite these warnings, the crackdowns rolled on and the workers kept disappearing. The meltdown added another layer of stress for small and mid-sized farmers already strained by equipment costs. Even if they somehow managed to scrape together money for a new tractor, they still couldn't find enough labor to bring crops out of the field. And as we'll see, the full weight of these combined disasters, high equipment prices, the labor shortage, and a brewing political storm would soon collide with a broader economic collapse that drove crop prices through the floor. For many American farmers, the ultimate gut punch came not from tariffs or outsourcing, but from plunging crop prices that left them financially crippled. Starting around 2022, global overproduction of staple crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat led to a surplus in the international markets. Countries like Brazil and Argentina ramped up production to compete with the United States, flooding the global supply chain with cheap alternatives. Commodity prices plummeted. Corn down by 37%, soybeans by 24%, and wheat by 35%. For an American farmer already dealing with higher equipment costs and labor issues, this was the final straw. When crop prices slump, farmers face an impossible choice: produce more to compensate for the lower prices, or scale back and hope that prices rebound. Both options can be ruinous. Producing more means investing in additional equipment, fertilizer, and labor, resources that are already priced at record highs thanks to tariffs and labor shortages. Scaling back can be just as deadly because smaller yields often fail to cover overhead costs, and farmland that sits idle rarely recovers from neglect without further investment. In either case, the result for many farmers was debt, followed by foreclosure or a forced sale. Small and mid-sized farms were especially vulnerable. Without the deep pockets of corporate agri-giants, these family-run operations couldn't ride out multiple years of low prices. Banks that might have once offered emergency loans or lines of credit grew stingy, seeing the collapse as a sign that the entire sector might be too risky to support. Families who had owned and worked the same land for generations suddenly found themselves placing for sale signs at the entrance to what had once been an enduring legacy. Meanwhile, the decline in farm income wasn't just an isolated rural problem. Towns that depended on agricultural commerce, feed stores, hardware outlets, diners, trucking companies also felt the blow. Empty storefronts and deserted main streets became common sights in what had once been bustling farming communities. Children who used to dream of taking over the family farm or launching small businesses in their hometowns left in search of opportunities elsewhere, turning many rural enclaves into virtual ghost towns. And while the price collapse hammered farmers financially, another blow arrived in the form of advanced automation, a development John Deere itself touted as the future of agriculture. But this future came with a hefty price tag, both literally and figuratively. Desperate to maintain relevance and recoup profits, John Deere funneled massive investments into what they proclaimed to be the ultimate solution: automation. Autonomous tractors, AI-driven seeders, drones that could map a field and micro-target irrigation, these technologies promised to revolutionize farming by slashing labor costs and boosting efficiency. Executives boasted about self-driving machinery that could work around the clock without breaks, braving even the harshest weather with machine-like precision. For massive corporate-owned farms with thousands of acres, these technologies seemed like a dream come true. Robots never unionized, never needed health insurance, and never punched a time clock. What was there not to love? The price, for starters. Buying a self-driving tractor, along with the subscription fees for proprietary software updates, cost anywhere from a few $100,000 to well over $500,000. The scale of investment required went far beyond the reach of smaller family farms that were already drowning in debt. As a result, Deere's technology gambit created a startling divide in American agriculture. On one side, corporate agribusinesses snapped up advanced machinery, using it to further increase crop yields and market share. On the other, the vast majority of small farmers watched from the sidelines, wishing they could afford the same shiny new toys. The heartbreak for many in rural America was that these advanced technologies effectively shut out the very people who had long remained loyal to the John Deere brand. If you couldn't afford the new self-driving combine, you were left behind in a market that increasingly favored larger, more mechanized operations. To make matters worse, the brand's already embattled reputation took another hit. John Deere found itself accused of prioritizing glitzy robots over real human employees. Many pointed out the irony. The company was using the profit margins gained from outsourcing labor to Mexico, thereby discarding American jobs, to bankroll the research and development of machines that would replace human operators altogether. Farmers and local communities began to view this progress with suspicion and resentment. Instead of saving the industry, automation felt like the final step in an ongoing campaign to transform farming from a community-oriented livelihood into just another cold corporate enterprise. At the heart of this transformation was a fundamental cultural shift. Farming, for decades, had been a very human endeavor, passed down through families, marked by tradition and resilience. Now, with machines and software taking center stage, many believed that the soul of American agriculture had been sold off for short-term gains. The dismantling of small family farms in the United States didn't happen overnight, but the rapid escalation of equipment costs, labor shortages, and collapsing prices accelerated a trend that had been unfolding quietly for decades. As a result, what had once been the backbone of rural America was systematically vanishing. Back in 1978, there were over 685,000 small farms scattered across the country. Today, fewer than 325,000 remain. That's more than half disappearing in the span of a single generation. What does it mean to lose a family farm? In many cases, it means losing an entire way of life, a cultural heritage that revolves around working the land, caring for livestock, and nurturing close-knit local communities. When a family farm goes under, it isn't just the owners who suffer. Feed stores, local diners, school districts, and main street shops all see their clientele dwindle and their revenue dry up. The disappearance of even a few farms can start a domino effect of closures, leaving small towns hollowed out in a matter of years. John Deere struggled to remain globally competitive, and the corporate decisions that followed played a major part in pushing these family farms to the brink. With tractor repair locked behind proprietary software, equipment prices spiking from tariffs, and no relief in sight from cratering commodity prices, family-owned operations had nowhere to turn. In some regions, corporate megafarms, supported by government subsidies and armed with the latest automated machinery, stepped in and bought land at dirt-cheap prices from families desperate to escape mounting debt. The farmland was still cultivated, but the sense of local stewardship and community pride gave way to massive, industrial-scale monoculture. One of the most painful dimensions of this trend is the generational aspect. For years, older farmers have watched their children choose other careers rather than return to the family farm. After seeing how unstable and emotionally taxing farming can be, many young adults decide they'd prefer the relative security of a job in healthcare, technology, or some other field. As older farmers age out or pass away, the lineage breaks. Their fields are sold, often to the highest bidder, removing the legacy of a family that once shaped the land and contributed to the spiritual fabric of rural America. At the core of it all is a sense of betrayal, the notion that national policy and corporate greed systematically starved small farmers of the resources and protections they needed to survive. While some might argue that this was simply the unstoppable march of modern economics, to the families living it, it felt deeply personal and alarmingly final. It wouldn't be the last challenge they faced, though, because nature herself was about to deliver another blow on top of everything else. Even if a farmer managed to weather the storms of high machinery costs, labor losses, and depressed crop prices, there was another, much more literal storm waiting in the wings. Climate change, once discussed mostly in abstract terms, made its presence undeniably known across American farmlands. Shifting weather patterns, extended droughts, catastrophic floods, and rampaging wildfires all combined to attack the agricultural heartland on multiple fronts. In the Midwest, drought conditions that used to be a once-in-a-decade inconvenience started occurring every few years, parching the soil and stunting crop growth. Fields of corn withered under relentless heat and minimal rainfall, while farmers in states like Iowa scrambled for irrigation solutions they'd never needed before. In California, wildfires destroyed entire vineyards and scorched farmland, leaving behind charred soil that would take years to recover, if it ever did. Meanwhile, the Mississippi River Basin saw record-breaking floods that submerged entire plots of farmland, washing away seeds, topsoil, and even livestock in some cases. These climate disasters weren't sporadic. They were part of a growing pattern tied to rising global temperatures. Warmer winters meant that pests once killed off by cold weather now survived to multiply and attack crops in the spring. Rain patterns shifted unpredictably, sometimes dumping months' worth of precipitation within a few days, and then leaving the region bone dry for weeks afterward. This erratic climate wreaked havoc on planting schedules, forcing farmers to gamble with narrower windows for each growing season. Insurance payouts soared, but many farmers discovered that crop insurance simply wasn't designed to cover the magnitude or frequency of these new weather extremes. Even when claims were approved, the money couldn't fully compensate for the infrastructure and topsoil damage that could take years to fix. Additionally, local banks, which might have considered a farm in a stable climate a safe investment, grew skittish. After all, how do you forecast stable revenue if floods, fires, or droughts might wipe out your crop at any moment? As if the climate crisis wasn't enough, the political storm swirling around these issues, particularly the trade war the administration initiated, continued to intensify. Under normal circumstances, farmers might have turned to the government for relief, but the next chapter in this saga would show that the White House was already locked in a fight that threatened to blow up the entire agricultural sector. So, what does the downfall of John Deere and the resulting collapse of American agriculture ultimately mean for the rest of us? If there's one lesson to be learned, it's that no brand, no matter how iconic or deeply woven into national identity, can survive turning its back on the communities that built it. In this saga, farmers, factory workers, and entire small towns were left feeling abandoned by a corporation that they had once treated like family. The betrayal set off a cataclysm that included tariffs, political feuds, labor crises, and plummeting crop prices. And just when these American communities needed relief the most, climate change arrived to magnify every vulnerability. Meanwhile, countries in Europe, Latin America, and Asia were ready to seize the moment. They filled the void in global markets that the United States once dominated, introducing cheaper equipment and reliable supply chains, forging new trade relationships, and offering accessible financing to struggling farmers worldwide. From the prairies of Argentina to the manufacturing hubs of India, new agricultural giants rose up, ensuring the U.S. wouldn't simply waltz back and reclaim its dominance. This profound shift in global power didn't only realign trade routes, it changed the social fabric of rural America. Family farms dwindled, towns emptied, and a generation that grew up trusting in Deere Green found themselves questioning everything. Many asked whether government policies could have mitigated some of the damage through better immigration reform, targeted subsidies for small farms, or a more measured approach to trade disputes. In hindsight, there were countless moments when a different decision or a different policy might have steered the industry onto a safer path. Yet, even in the face of such dire outcomes, some hold out hope that American agriculture can rebuild. Perhaps a mix of new technologies, more inclusive policymaking, and consumer support for local farmers will offer a future lifeline. Others argue that once a system collapses so comprehensively, recovery may be limited to specialized niches like organic produce, heritage grains, or artisanal dairy. If and when the U.S. can recapture a fraction of its lost global market share, it will require a monumental effort that addresses climate resilience, fair labor practices, modernization of rural infrastructure, and a shift away from big corporate control. Thank you for joining this journey through the rise, fall, and global shockwaves caused by the John Deere saga. Stay tuned for more episodes exploring the twists and turns of hidden economic battles, behind-the-scenes betrayals, and the dramatic shifts redefining our modern world, one collapse at a time.